everybody, and welcome back to I Just Want to Talk About the Bible. If this is your first time joining us, then let me just welcome you and say that I am so glad that you're here. My name is Christian Keeter, and I live in the southeast of the United States of America with my amazing, beautiful, godly wife, Lacey, and our two wonderful daughters, Felicity and Serenity. So let me begin today by reading you guys a quote that I also shared with you guys in the most recent podcast episode prior to this one. And this is just part of a much longer quote that I read then, but I thought it'd be a great way to begin our discussion today. And the quote is this: "Human beings resist facing reality. The human capacity for self-deception is staggering." Again, human beings resist facing reality. The human capacity for self-deception is staggering. And that was said by Pastor John Mark Comer in his book, Practicing the Way, which I recommend that each and every one of you go out and buy and read. I thought it was phenomenal. So human beings resist facing reality. The human capacity for self-deception is staggering. And this is one of the reasons, which was the point of the other episode, that we need to be in community, right? We can see things in one another that we won't see in and of ourselves. However, today we're going to be looking at one specific, I guess you could say, application of that truth, of the truth seen in that quote. And we're going to begin by looking at the example of Simon Peter, one of the 12 disciples, arguably the most vocal of the 12 disciples. So we're going to begin by reading in Matthew chapter 26. This is going to be right after the Lord's Supper. Judas has already departed to go betray Jesus into the hands of the Jewish leaders. So this is the night before his crucifixion and when they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he is, of course, betrayed. So beginning in Matthew 26, verse 30, it says, "And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee.' Peter answered him, 'Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away.' Jesus said to him, 'Truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, 'Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you.' And all the disciples said the same." So that was Matthew 26, 30 through 35. This is a famous passage. So this is before they get to Gethsemane. Jesus is talking with his disciples. And Jesus says, you're all going to fall away. Again, you will all fall away because of me this night. And Peter basically says, listen, even if all these other jokers fall away, he says, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Which you got to wonder about the other 10, because remember, Judas has already left, so the other 10 disciples are still there. If they were just like, what the heck, dude? Like, he just publicly threw us under the bus. But Jesus says to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. So all the disciples reiterated what Peter says here. They're all basically saying, listen, we will not deny you, even if it means our death. We know how this story goes. But let's slow down and just kind of be in this moment a little bit so we can feel the point that we're going to draw out a little bit more. So this is at the end of the Last Supper. This is shortly before they go to the garden, shortly, just presumably a few hours before the guards come and arrest Jesus. And Jesus is saying to the 11 here, you will all fall away tonight, right? He said, you will all fall away because of me this night. And that's going to happen in just a few hours. So they get up, they go to Gethsemane, they're there. Whenever, and I'm going to just kind of skim across the surface here. Although in kind of the first draft of the notes when I was putting together for this episode, I was going to talk about this section, or at least part of it, a little bit more, because there's so much cool stuff in it. But I think that's just another conversation for another time, and I would end up just getting into too much detail that would confuse the purpose for today. But so basically summarizing, after this, Jesus goes with the 11 disciples to Gethsemane, and when he gets to Gethsemane, he takes Peter, James, and John further into the garden with him. Then Jesus, of course, prays to his Father about if there's any other way than what he's about to face, right? But if not, that the Father's will would be done. Not as I will, but as you will. So Judas arrives with the guards and betrays Jesus. Peter chops off the high priest's servant's ear, Malchus by name, which Jesus heals, which, just as a side note, I know I said I'm not going to get into much detail there, but it's just it's really noteworthy how Jesus undoes something that somebody else did in his name. And that observation is not unique with me. Like I've shared before, I'm also on staff with a ministry called Mentoring Men for the Master, and my boss in that ministry, who's also just a great friend and who has discipled me for many years, he one time taught a message based on that very topic right there, about how Peter chopped off Malchus's ear and how Jesus went and basically cleaned up a mess that was made in his name, and how we just want to be careful that we don't just, in our wake, leave a bunch of ears lying on the ground, so to speak, that Jesus has to come behind us and clean up. So we just want to be wise, and whenever we think about doing things in his name and representing him, right? But that's a conversation for another time. But it was such a good point that I just couldn't gloss over it. So Jesus, of course, allows himself to be taken captive. It's not that they overpowered Jesus. In fact, what Jesus said to Peter after Peter attacked Malchus, it says in Matthew 26, beginning of verse 52, "Then Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scripture be fulfilled that it must be so?'" That was Matthew 26, 52 through 54. And actually one really, really cool detail from John's recounting of this incident is here in John 18, where the guards come, and beginning in verse 4 of John 18, it says, "Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, 'Whom do you seek?' They answered him, 'Jesus of Nazareth.' Jesus said to them, 'I am he.' Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, 'I am he,' they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, 'Whom do you seek?' And they said, 'Jesus of Nazareth.' Jesus answered, 'I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go.' This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, 'Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one.'" And then it's right after that, after this conversation, that Peter actually takes out the sword and attacks Malchus. So that was John 18, 4 through 9. But I love that, where you just look at the power of Jesus here. Then Jesus, this band of guards is here, and he says, "Whom do you seek?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Or in Greek, it is literally, "I am." He said, "I am." Now, I said I was going to not get into details because, I was just going to skim across the surface here. And here I am getting into the very thing that I said that I was going to skim across. But just indulge me for a minute, because this is so cool. So about this whole thing with Jesus saying, "I am," let me just read you a part of a quote from the New English Translation footnote from this John 18 passage about the response of the guards. It says, "The reaction on the part of those who came to arrest Jesus comes in response to his affirmation that he is indeed the one they are seeking, Jesus the Nazarene. But Jesus makes his affirmation of his identity using a formula which the reader has encountered before in the fourth gospel. Jesus has applied to himself the divine name of Exodus 3:14, 'I am.' Therefore, this amounts to something of a theophany." Let me cut in here really quickly. A theophany is an appearance of God. That's what the word theophany means. So again, therefore, this amounts to something of a theophany which causes even his enemies to recoil and prostrate themselves, so that Jesus has to ask a second time, "Who are you looking for?" This is a vivid reminder to the reader of the gospel that even in this dark hour, Jesus holds ultimate power over his enemies and the powers of darkness, because he is the one who bears the divine name. That's the end of the quote. So basically, what this quote is saying, what's being drawn out here, is where Jesus, he says, "Whom whom do you seek? They say, Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, I am. And they fall to the ground, and they get up, and he asks them a second time. And this statement, I am, should draw our minds back not only to things that have been included earlier in the book of John, or the gospel according to John, that Jesus has said, but also all the way back to when God revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush and told him his name, I am. Remember? Back in Exodus 3:14. Jesus is God, right? So this is, I just include this as a side note to say that Jesus was not taken by force during this arrest. Jesus allowed himself to be taken. Okay. So after, Jesus is taken, it says back in, let's see here, Matthew 26, down here in verse 56, at the end of verse 56, it says, then all the disciples left him and fled. So here we see the very thing that Jesus was talking about earlier, right? Where he says in verse 31 of Matthew 26, he says, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. That's exactly what has happened here. He's being taken, and it says that all the disciples left him and fled. They left him and fled. So from here, he's going to be taken before Caiaphas, who is the high priest. He's going to be falsely accused of blasphemy and condemned to death. So let's hop down here to Matthew 26, 69 through 75. Because remember, I know we've kind of taken a couple of detours here, but bear with me. The purpose of what we're looking at is we're looking at Peter's response here. And so just again, to ground us in what we're focusing on, remember, Peter said, after Jesus said, you will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Back here it says, Peter answered him, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Jesus goes on to tell him that before the rooster crows, Peter's going to deny him 3 times. And Peter doubles down and says, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. So Peter is saying, no, Lord, you're wrong. You're wrong, is what he's telling him. And all the disciples said the same. So keeping that in mind, that Peter has said this, and so far in this narrative, we've already seen all the disciples scatter when Jesus was arrested. Here in Matthew 26, I'm going to read 69 through 75, it says this. Now, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, right? So then, you have Peter following kind of from a distance. It says back in verse 58, and Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. So that was verse 58 of Matthew 26. So now again, down in verse 69, he's sitting out in this courtyard. And it says, and a servant girl came up to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean. First denial, right? So resuming. And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath. I do not know the man. Second denial. After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. So we see the 3 denials there, right? And you see the escalation. First, he just says, I don't know what you mean. He's like, I don't know what you mean. He says that to the first servant girl. He denies in front of all the people who are present there. A servant girl came up and said to him, you also were with Jesus of Galilean, but he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean. So then there's a second servant girl who says, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And it says, and again he denied him. This time, though, it says, with an oath. I do not know the man. So there's an escalation happening, and it builds up to this crescendo right here. So some of the bystanders come up and they say to Peter, hey, listen, we recognize your accent. You ain't from around here, Peter. We're down in, we're down in Judea. Your accent betrays you, right? So presumably because he's up from Galilee. right? And again, if you go back to the first thing the first servant girl said, it says, you also were with Jesus the Galilean, right? So now Peter's way of speaking shows that he is up from Galilee. And then listen, how does he respond? He doesn't just deny him. He doesn't just deny him with an oath. It says, then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. I do not know the man. Invoking a curse on himself and swearing, I do not know the man. And then there's the tragedy. Like Peter realizes what he had done. And immediately the rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, and where Jesus told him this very thing would happen. That apparently Jesus did know Peter better than Peter knew himself, despite Peter's disagreeing with Jesus. And what's Peter's response? Well, his response is totally reasonable at this point. He goes out and weeps bitterly. He leaves. He's sobbing. He is completely shattered. So, what is... And actually, before I go on, I'm sorry just to pause mid-sentence like that. Let me share with you an interesting detail here from Luke 22, which is Luke's recounting of the same thing we just read from Matthew. So, of course, Peter, this is Peter's denying him, and so we go through the three denials, right? And then it says this is halfway through verse 60. It says, and immediately while he was speaking, I'll begin with the beginning of verse 60. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you were talking about. And immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. Listen to this next line. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. So I don't know how exactly, like the whole line of sight thing. I don't know if Peter could see Jesus through a window, exactly how this worked, but it has this detail of, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he said, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And again, and he went out and wept bitterly. Whew, okay, so very heavy. So what exactly happened with Peter? We have this thing where Peter is so vehemently saying, like, I will never deny you. Even if all these other losers deny you, I never will. Right? And he says, I will die before I deny you. Not only did Peter not die before he denied him, but the night didn't even end before Peter denied him 3 times. So what happened? So here's the question. When Peter was being so vehement, was he lying to Jesus? When he was saying, I'll never deny you, was he lying to Jesus in that moment? I don't think he was lying. What I mean is, I think Peter fully believed what Peter was saying. I think Peter was so convinced of what he was saying that he basically couldn't receive anything else, even from the Lord, couldn't hear anything contrary to that. Because remember, whenever Jesus says, no, tonight, you will deny me 3 times, he says, even if I have to die, I'm not going to do that. I don't think Peter was making this up. I think that Peter was fully convinced that he would not deny Jesus. Nevertheless, we do see him denying Jesus, not once, not twice, but thrice. There's a word for you. Try to work thrice into conversation today. So, what is this? What is happening here? Well, one thing is for sure. Peter thought he was further along than he was, but Jesus knew right where he was. And Peter had an idea about how he would respond in a circumstance that he had never quite been in before. But Jesus knew exactly where Peter was. He knew exactly how Peter would respond. Right? In fact, if you look in Luke's account of this, there's this, let's see here, so Luke 22, Jesus says in verse 31 through 34, he says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. So here, that was Luke 22:31 through 34. So, Peter thinks he is in one place as far as his character, his own strength, his commitment to Jesus. Jesus knows exactly where Peter is, and Jesus knows how Peter will respond. And what is one of the things that Jesus says to him? He says, but I've prayed for you. But I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. So Jesus knew right where Peter was. Jesus prayed for Peter. And in fact, in Peter, we see the principle behind verses like Proverbs 17:3 played out, which says, the crucible is for silver and the furnace is for gold, and the Lord tests hearts. Where just like with precious metals like silver and gold, what exposes the impurities and therefore is in the process of them being purified is heat, is fire, it's heat. Heat is what causes the impurities in these metals to become manifest, to rise to the surface so that they can be removed. And likewise, heat in our lives causes things to come to the surface, things that we might not have even known were there. Just like Peter here. Just like Peter, where he clearly did not believe that he was going to respond this way. Now, of course, we know that Peter, goes on to be restored by Jesus after the resurrection on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is also called the Sea of Tiberias. In that conversation, Jesus asks Peter 3 times if Peter loves him. And then, of course, Jesus commissions Peter to feed his lambs and tend his sheep. Jesus restores Peter. So just like there was a 3-fold denial, there's a 3-fold kind of restoration here where Jesus asks him 3 times, do you love me? So, but the point is that Peter thought he was further along than he was, and all it took was a certain set of circumstances to draw it out. His character was only, quote, good because it had not had the right mixture of situations, of circumstances, for it to be bad, so to speak. And already, I hope we see quickly how humble this should make us. Because before we're too critical of Peter, before we're like, oh my gosh, what a loser. How could he do that? If I were in Peter's shoes, I wouldn't have. But, in that moment, we are saying literally the same thing he said of the other 10 disciples, where he said, even if they all do it, I never would. And we could be like, well, even though Peter did it, I never would. We should be really cautious whenever we, look in the scriptures where we're like, man, if I had been walking on the water with Jesus, I wouldn't have sunk, or so on and so forth. Let's, how about a little humility on our part? Let's just say, I know how I hope I would respond, but I've never been in a circumstance exactly like that one. Lord, help me. I think a much better response from Peter, instead of disagreeing with Jesus and telling him that he was wrong when Jesus said, you're going to deny me 3 times, a much better response would be like, Lord, help me. What do I do? I don't want to do that. That would be, in other words, humility as opposed to pride. So Peter had an overinflated view of himself. But like I said before, we're too critical of Peter. Could it be possible that we are the same way sometimes? Could it be possible that we have an overinflated view of our own character and what we would do if we were in a situation? Could it be possible that we are perhaps a little prideful in this way? Like I said, Peter's character was only, quote, good because it hadn't had just the right opportunity for his true character, his true kind of like this dark corner, like to manifest itself. And then he was purified of it, actually, I think that after, his restoration by Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, I think that Peter had a new level of humility and had a much lower estimation of his own greatness and his own personal strength, right? So, said in another way, we may very well respond differently to circumstances we've never been in before than we think we would, right? Like that's, I think, the right sort of posture to have, and that would lead us to things like, dependence on the Lord for his power and his strength, coming to him every day, and so on and so forth. But here's the problem, and this is where we're kind of going with this. I mean, we can stop there and be like, okay, we should all be humble. But here's the problem. We have a hand in this process a little bit, and we can sometimes unintentionally place ourselves, actually try to put ourselves forward into circumstances where we might not be ready to step into them. We might place stumbling blocks in front of ourselves. We might shoot ourselves in the foot, because here's the problem. Our natural tendency as humans is to try to outpace our character. We're like almost always trying to outpace our character because we're not patient. And so what do I mean by this? I mean that we are constantly wanting the promotion, a greater amount of influence, more honor, a bigger salary, or so on, right? But we never stop to ask the question, do I actually have the character to handle the next step? Do I actually have the character to handle the very thing that I want? Or would that thing, which is good in and of itself perhaps, would that thing become a stumbling block to me? And those are just some examples. A greater amount of influence, the promotion, more honor, bigger salary, so on. You could probably fill that in with tons of different circumstances. A local pastor here in my town once put it this way, and I'll probably never forget this quote, and I think I might have used it on this podcast before, but he says, "Never let your talent take you further than your character can sustain you." That's a good word, y'all. He said, never let your talent take you further than your character can sustain you. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, what just happened here? We were just talking about Peter, and now we're talking about our circumstances changing, and we're talking about how Peter failed the test, and now we seem to be talking about something a little bit different. Well, I just want to clearly state what the link in the chain is, and the link in the chain is character. And not only character, but also our propensity to misjudge how we will handle things that we've never been in before. So that is the link in the chain. It is all character and how we should be careful about jumping to conclusions about how we will respond to something, how we will handle something. In Peter's situation, we were talking about how he responded to this test, and we see that he failed. And now we're looking at the examples from our own lives about perhaps circumstances that we want to change. However, we might not yet have the character to be able to handle those sorts of changes yet. But what if there are circumstances that we'd like to see some movement in, but it is actually a gift to us from the Lord that there is a delay? To put that another way, what if God is working on developing our character, but maybe we're missing it because we're just simply focused on our circumstances? Because here's the thing, guys, we so need our character to be developed. And I think that one of arguably the most important character quality that we could ever have, that could ever be developed in us, is humility. I think about where, it says God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And I just wonder, it's just like, do we see lack of progress in circumstances as an opportunity to grow? As an opportunity to, okay, I must not be quite ready for blank yet because I'm not in that circumstance. Therefore, what can I do that's productive right now? What if I were to focus on my character? What if I were to focus on how I need to grow? What if I were to focus on becoming the kind of person who will succeed at blank whenever I step into that? But we don't naturally think that way. On the contrary, we spend a lot of time thinking about our circumstances and only a little time thinking about our character. But what if we were to switch that and to, flip that around and spend more time focusing on developing our character and less time focusing on how we want our circumstances to change? Because here's the thing, and this is the hard thing, but character development takes time. We don't change overnight. And so we can become impatient when our circumstances don't change if we're not having the right perspective on this. So let's look at an interesting example from 1 Timothy chapter 3. So 1 Timothy chapter 3, these are the qualifications. So Paul is writing to Timothy, And these are qualifications for overseers or elders. So if somebody wants to occupy the office of an overseer / elder, these are things that need to be true of this person. So I am not going to read through the entire passage here, which is 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. There's just one aspect of this that I want to draw attention to, and it's verse 6, which says, he must not be a recent convert. So let's just pause there. So we're talking about people who occupy a position of spiritual leadership in the church, elder / overseer. It says he must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. So now this is just, that was 1 Timothy 3:6. This is just one example of the principle that I'm talking about, and this is specifically within kind of the context of leadership of a local church. But we're talking, so that is a position within a local church, and it says this person, one of the qualifications is they must not be a recent convert. Why? Because their character can't sustain it. They said, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. In other words, prideful, not humble. Like I said, arguably the most important character quality that could ever be developed in us is humility. But you might say, but Christian, I'm not aspiring to be an overseer. You might be, you might not be. Nevertheless, this principle applies across a myriad of scenarios. The basic principle is this: time is necessary for character growth. Now, just because time passes, there we go. That's the word. Just because time passes doesn't mean character automatically develops. It is possible to go over long periods of chronological time and have made very little growth. I mean, the Bible even acknowledges this in passages like in Hebrews 5, where the author says, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, you guys ought to be teachers by this point, but you still need milk because you're not ready for solid food. Like, they had stalled out. By this time, you should be teachers, but you're not. So the Bible acknowledges the reality of that, of course. However, although time doesn't necessarily equal maturity, there is no maturity without time. It just takes time. Character development does take time. It's not an automatic thing. We have to cooperate and do our part, learn the lessons that the Lord is showing us, and not just continue to stiffen our necks and things like that. But we need to but the point is this: character takes time, and the most important character quality we can develop is humility. Because, like it says here, this person could move into a new position. And I'm sure if a recent convert were to move into this position of overseer, they're not thinking, hey, I'm going to become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. No one would say that. That's completely insane for somebody to be like, that's my goal. My goal is for this to happen, right? No, they would go in presumably with pure motives and think, hey, I'm going to do well at this. But like Peter, they might not know. I hope they would do well, but they might not know. So, the question is, are we faithful in the circumstances we find ourselves in right now? We can think about how we'll be faithful in the circumstances that we want to be in when they come, but are we faithful in the circumstances we're in right now? And if we're not, why would we expect anything to change, right? Jesus said, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. That was Luke 16:10, and the original context of that was regarding finances, wealth, right? But that principle is, you can just see, that is a broad principle that applies in so many different things. It could apply to influence. It could apply to just where you are with your, like in your job, where it's like, are you faithful in your current position? If not, then why do you think you could handle the promotion? Just things like that. And by the way, guys, I'm not pointing the finger. I see this so much in myself, and I've seen such a desire in me, in my life, to progress in certain ways, and such a small amount of time dedicated to, well, what if, like, am I quite ready for that, whatever that may be? And God graciously will, because he doesn't want to set us up for failure, hold us back and develop us. The question is, do we cooperate, or are we kicking and screaming, right? One thing that my pastor said is, Don't ask God for what's next if you haven't been faithful with what's now. Don't ask God for what's next if you haven't been faithful to God with what's now. We look at people like David. David was anointed king, but he went through a pretty rigorous character development program when he was being wrongly pursued by Saul before David even ascended the throne. He had been anointed, and then he, later ascended the throne. But between those two kind of mile markers, there was a long time of being wrongly pursued by a pretty psychotic leader, right? But this was a time of, no doubt, character development for David. And even then, he still messed up pretty bad a few times. Guys, we should not rush character development. We really shouldn't. Let's look at one more passage here from Deuteronomy 8. This is a passage that I've talked about on this podcast before, but is very relevant, and I want to return to it here because it ties in to this so clearly. So this is, Deuteronomy is kind of like final speeches of Moses before they enter into the promised land. They've, of course, been wandering the wilderness for 40 years, and they're about to pass into the promised land, and this is going to be under the leadership of Joshua because Moses will die at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. So in Deuteronomy 8, let me read verses 1 through 3. It says, "The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." That's Deuteronomy 8, 1 through 3. And of course, there's that famous verse that Jesus quotes in the wilderness when he's being tempted by the devil, as far as man does not live by bread alone. So we're reflecting back on the 40 years in the wilderness. Were the 40 years a time of abundance? Well, it was definitely a time of provision. God took care of them. He provided food for them. He provided water for them. Like he absolutely took care of them in the wilderness, right? But now they're about to move into something new when they move into the promised land. And there is this warning that comes in. So we see that when they were led in the wilderness, it says that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. It says that he might humble you. And then it says later on, and he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, right? So we see that part of this wilderness wandering was for the purpose of them being humbled. And so let's look a little bit further down in Deuteronomy, beginning in verse 11 now, and see where all this is going to lead. So it says, "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end." So let's pause there before we go any further on. So he talks about, he's like, be careful that you don't forget. Don't forget the Lord. When you get into the land and all is good, when you have eaten and are full, you've built houses, your herds and flocks are multiplied, your silver and gold is multiplied, all that you have is multiplied. Be careful that your heart not be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, right? How he took care of you in the wilderness. But in all this stuff, it says, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, right? And so what's the purpose of all this wilderness right here? That he might humble you and test you to what end? To do you good in the end. The ultimate objective is God is setting these people up for success. The humbling is to set them up for success so that they don't become victims of prosperity and success. Because sometimes, if we don't have the character to sustain it, it can ruin us. Getting the very thing that we think we want can sometimes ruin us if we don't have the character to sustain it. So in the quote wilderness, are you allowing the process to humble you? Am I allowing the process to humble me? And they were in the wilderness a long time. The passage goes on to say, "Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is this day. And if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God." So there at the end, there's this warning to the Hebrews as they're about to enter into the promised land, right? And we know that if you follow the history, they do end up going after other gods. They do end up forgetting the Lord. And there's the Assyrian invasion for the tribes in the north, and then there's the Babylonian invasion for the tribe of Judah, and they all go into exile. They did forget. But look at the principle here. Like I said, you could summarize it as be careful not to become victims of prosperity and success. The idea is that the Lord humbled them so as to do good to them. However, once things became easier, they may very well forget the Lord and begin to take credit for his blessings in their lives. And we would, of course, say, "Oh, I would never do that." Just like we would look at Peter and say, "Oh, I would never do that." But let's be careful here. Let's be careful. Let's seek to cultivate some humility in our lives, right? Jesus said, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." And he also said, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." That was Matthew 23:12 and Luke 14:11, respectively. But I want to draw something out about this. Notice the reflexive nature of what Jesus says here. Reflexive meaning it is something one does to oneself. So notice the role we have to play in this. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. That's, again, Matthew 23:12 and Luke 14:11. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. We have a role to play in this. And part of what humility cultivation looks like in this process is to, kind of submit to the process, or really submit to the Lord in the process. Ask the question of the Lord. It's like, okay, what is being developed in me right now through all of this? And then cooperate. And gratitude will be an indispensable part of this as well. We oftentimes will delay gratitude in our minds, thinking, I'll be grateful when blank. But just like with these other things, if we're not grateful now, then we have no reason to think we'll be grateful later. We, might express gratitude to the Lord in a short-lived sort of way if we get something we want. But as far as gratitude as a lifestyle, not just an action from time to time, that is something that can be cultivated now. And all these things are some practical ways of what humility cultivation could look like. But really, it's just this. Will we be willing to spend more time thinking about our character than the circumstances we would like to see change? Would we be willing to focus on character, not opportunity or position or circumstance? Because again, sometimes, like, premature success is the worst thing that could happen to someone. And God has us each on a curriculum. We just need to be faithful where we are right now and not be too eager to be promoted or have the change or whatever it may be in our specific circumstance. It's fine to desire these things and to ask God for these things. I'm not saying otherwise. I didn't say we should spend all our time thinking about character and none of our time thinking about circumstances. I just said I think we should spend most of our time thinking about our character and less of our time thinking about our circumstances as far as those two things is concerned. Not none of our time, because we see petitions all throughout the Bible, people asking God to change circumstances, and it happens. I'm not suggesting otherwise. All I'm saying is that if we get this backwards and we spend all of our time thinking about our circumstances, all that's going to do is cultivate frustration, bitterness, and impatience, right? And even more dangerously than these kind of, I wouldn't say more dangerously, I guess this is kind of the natural outflow of those things. We oftentimes see people try to take matters into their own hands whenever they don't feel like God is moving at the pace that they would like for them to, and that's when we do things like birth Ishmaels, right? But I just can't overstate how important humility and character development is. So it's like, if we want to be You could just list out like a series of things. Do you want to be promoted at work? Become the kind of person who will succeed in that position and not let the power go to his or her head. You want to find someone to marry? Become the kind of person someone godly would want to marry. Honor God in your singleness, and every iota of character development you can experience now as a single is an investment in your future marriage and setting you and your future spouse up for success. You want more influence? Focus on loving and serving those with whom you have influence right now, putting their needs above your own. And we could continue to list examples. I'm just kind of throwing some out there that I thought might land with somebody, but you get the point. So what is it for you? And what is God cultivating in you? And do we have the courage to ask God that very question? Do we have the courage to trust Him with our circumstances and focus on character development, to humble ourselves, to do our part in this process? So let me pray, and then I will let you guys get on with your day. So Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for your love and for your patience and your commitment to us. Thank you, Lord, for all the circumstances that you have held back from us, knowing that if we got these things too early, whatever the change in circumstance might be, Lord, that it would set us up for failure, that it might ruin us, that we didn't have the character at the time to sustain it. And so, Lord, I pray that you show each of us, Lord, every single one of us right now who's hearing my voice, myself included, at the front of that list, Lord, what is it that you're developing in us right now? What are you showing us? What are you developing in us? How can we cooperate? And Lord, I pray that you help us to do it, that you give us the courage to do whatever it looks like to do that. But Lord, we love you and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, my friends, in closing, just a few quick things. As I've shared before, I am also on staff with a ministry called Mentoring Men for the Master, which is a discipleship ministry. So if you are interested in somebody coming alongside you and investing in your relationship with Jesus, or if you would like to do that with somebody else, feel free to reach out to us. I've included info on how to do so in the footer of every podcast episode. And don't let the name fool you. Although it's called Mentoring Men for the Master, this invitation is open to both men and women, regardless of where you are, literally anywhere on the planet. We have things set up that long distance discipleship is not only possible, but something that we do like every week. Secondly, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the newsletter if you want to begin receiving that. And I want to say this especially for those of you who have ever given to this podcast, and I would like to direct your attention to the most recent podcast newsletter, which there's a link to in the description as well, in addition to the place where you can sign up for it. Because in that newsletter, we discuss some of the things that through your generosity, the Lord has empowered us to fund. And lastly, I just want to talk about the Bible is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any and all gifts given are tax deductible. So if you feel so led to give, instructions on how to do so can be found in the footer of every podcast episode description. And let me just say thank you so much to those of you who have already given. May the Lord bless you abundantly for your generosity. All right, brothers and sisters, until next time, God bless you.